A quick nod to the people involved in the project, the Saltmarsh Restoration Project, and also a quick nod to the funding partners of the Estuaries Partnership. Okay. We have 5 estuaries in South Devon AOMB. They are all Rhea-type estuaries. So these were riverbeds carved out through the last ice age, and then as the sea levels rose, flooding these river valleys. So in fact, nearly all the estuaries in the southwest are these Rhea-type estuaries, meaning that they are deep, narrow and steep-sided. And that's why our salt marshes are similarly long and narrow, because these, as you'll see, are ecosystems that form along the edges of the estuaries. To explain something about salt marshes, we need to understand our shores. So the foreshore is an area that's covered and uncovered twice a day by the tides, as you'll realise. And when you see a man-made structure like this, you can see the impact of that on the zones on the foreshore. So the foreshore is quite a difficult place to live. Everything that lives there has to be is exposed to whatever's happening with the weather twice a day, and of course is flooded by the salty waters. And those two things have a massive impact. Almost everything on the foreshore is marine, and they are kind of tolerant of fresh water more than land plants and animals that have moved into the sea, because salt is toxic to so many things. The seaweeds at the bottom have the easiest life. You know, they're only exposed for part of the day. The seaweeds right at the top, they're exposed for most of the day. So they have to be really hardy. So this is why you get these stripes. On shallower bits of foreshore, on a different kind of sediment, we start to get the salt marsh, right at the very, very top of the foreshore. Indeed, it's an area of the foreshore that isn't covered by the tide every single day. If an area of foreshore is covered by the tide every day, every tide, then it's dominated by the seaweeds. So you get the salt marshes above that. So you can see it here quite nicely. There is one salt marsh plant that will tolerate being flooded with every tide, but all of the rest of them, you know, it's just a delicate balance. Some of the salt marsh plants will tolerate being completely inundated with water. Some of them will only tolerate getting their roots wet. Interesting thing about salt marsh plants is that these are particularly salt tolerant plants, and it's the salt that is kind of affecting them most. If it wasn't for the salt, the land plants would be able to migrate down and outcompete them. What's particularly interesting, I find, about these plants is the mechanisms that they have to be able to deal with or tolerate this salt. And they have mechanisms to exclude the salt in the first place. So they may have other salts that sort of have that osmotic pressure to keep the salt out. Some of them actively have glands to pump the salt out of them. Some of them are kind of fleshy and succulent, so they have more water in them. Maybe this just dilutes the salt that does get into them. And then there's also passive removal. So some plants actually divert the salt into older leaves and then discard those leaves. Other plants have a very short life cycle. So long as they can get to the stage of flowering and producing seed, they've done all they want to do. So even though the salt might catch up with them and kill them, so long as they've set seed, they're okay, they're happy, they've done their thing. So just a quick look at a few of these plants. This is rock samphire. No, it's not rock samphire, it's marsh samphire, sorry. I always get confused about the two. But it's also known as glasswort. Sometimes if you go to a restaurant, they'll give you this on your plate. It is a perennial one, and it's one of the few salt marsh plants that actually grows more healthily in salt water. We also need to consider reed beds, tidal reed beds. These can be very salt tolerant too, and they're an odd one because they will also grow very healthy reed beds in entirely freshwater conditions. And they seem to grow particularly well where the salt floods over their roots, but there seems to be an upwelling of fresh water at the same time. Other places you get the more traditional looking salt marsh. This is the poster child of the salt marsh world, the sea aster. To all intents and purposes, it looks very much like some of the flowers that we have in our gardens, and I could think of the name 2 seconds ago and now I can't. That's great, isn't it?
Michaelmas daisies.
Michaelmas daisies, thank you so much. That's the ones. Yeah. And we shouldn't forget either that these are a whole ecosystem. They're a whole community of wildlife. It's not just as plants, but animals too. And because of the tide sort of coming in and out, a lot of the animals that enjoy these salt marshes have to migrate in and out with the tide. So when the tide comes in, there's a number of fish that will go and enjoy the shelter amongst the salt marsh. If you can see here, these parallel lines in the surface of the mud made by grey mullet that feed on diatoms on the surface of the mud, and they make these double lines. You get things like crabs that will either hunker down into the mud, or they may sort of migrate to some extent as well. And then there's quite a number of insects. I didn't, as a marine biologist, I didn't normally think of insects as being tolerant of salt water, but there's actually quite a number of insects that do thrive in these salt marshes. Probably not down amongst the seaweeds, but certainly within the salt marsh. Salt marshes are reasonably seasonal, so right now they're probably in their worst condition. The plants have died off, and I'm afraid they don't look very sexy. Give it a few weeks, they green up, and the flowers will come out, and that's when to see them. That's when they look most attractive. And part of our project is to get people excited about salt marshes. And now is probably not the best time to be doing that, but there you go. So, in the words of Monty Python, what have salt marshes ever done for us? Well, quite a number of things actually. They improve water quality. I don't mean they sort of zap all the bacteria or something, but they mop up some of the nutrients. And they also, because of the way that the plants stick out of the water, they slow the water down when it gets in amongst the salt marsh, and that causes all the organic material to settle out, so they trap a lot of material. They enhance their biodiversity. Estuaries are funny places. They have a relatively low diversity of wildlife, but that wildlife that can thrive there are there in stupidly big numbers. Food provision, probably not so much of a thing in our southwest estuaries, but more of a thing on these big, wide expanses of salt marsh that you have in the places like East Anglia. Flood and coastal defence, again, it's that buffering, that slowing, buffering the waves as they hit the side that just help protect the shores. Recreation and well-being. As we paddle around, as we enjoy their estuaries, we like to see these green edges. We like to see the trees beyond. So they just add that extra something. They help with fisheries production. A lot of fish, commercially important fish that we eat, they will spend their time in estuaries during, as egg-laying grounds and nursery areas for young fish. And as the tide comes in, bringing in the predatory fish, these smaller fish will go up into the salt marshes or in amongst the seaweed to hide. As I mentioned, with improved water quality, they mop up some of the nutrients from our estuaries. And also, hugely importantly, as carbon sinks. So when you look at that, for one thing, being plants, they take out carbon dioxide and they assimilate that into the plants themselves. And when the salt marsh plant dies, that carbon then gets trapped within the mud. But because of this 3D nature of salt marshes trapping that detritus, they actually trap a lot more carbon than just that they sequester themselves. And that's, layer upon layer over hundreds, if not thousands of years. There are parts of our estuaries that are maybe 10, 12, 15 metres deep. They lock up a huge amount of carbon, and the salt marshes are one of these places. Now it's reckoned that our salt marshes can trap more carbon than forests. So we need to be very careful with these graphs and things, making sure that we're comparing apples with apples, not apples with pears. So look very carefully, what is the graph showing you? The amount of carbon that's sequestered, the amount of carbon that's trapped, or the amount of carbon that's locked away. But salt marshes, seagrass beds, estuarine mudflats, all hugely important for the amount of carbon that they lock away for millennia. And that's why sometimes salt marshes can look less attractive, because they attract and trap all this detritus. To our eyes, it's twigs, it's leaves and everything else, flotsam and jetsam, but it also means that they trap a lot of litter. So I'm afraid salt marshes can look less attractive because of the amount of litter that they also trap. But that's a modern day thing. Traditionally, it would have been just twigs, leaves and the likes. So what can we do to protect them? Very often they will have these kind of steep edges, and you get some wave action that will undercut them. But this is a natural kind of cycle. But our activities and our boats, if we make too much wake, we can sort of make it that much worse. Things that we can do, this is in the Follaton say, put down posts, tie them together, and then use natural detritus as a barrier behind, and then you'll get extra accretion of material behind and more salt marsh to stabilise that behind. Sometimes we can actually artificially plant the plants, but then those plants themselves need some kind of protection. So this is a matrix made from potato starch that's been planted up and then anchored in place with stakes. This is something that could be considered in places like Sharper Marsh, not to protect the marsh, but just to add a complexity of habitat. So, just to maybe have some pools of water that are more slowly draining. One of the things about our southwest estuaries, very often we've built seawalls and things, and then if there's a bit of salt marsh in front of that, with sea level rise, naturally the salt marsh would be able to migrate up the shore. But if we have an artificial barrier in the way, the habitat of the salt marsh is squeezed against it, and we all lose out. If at all possible, it's better to move that barrier back so that the salt marsh can migrate up semi-naturally up the shore, and then the salt marsh will have that buffer effect and help. So, if that's called managed realignment, and we've actually, people have actually reckoned that managed realigned salt marshes actually trap more carbon than even naturally occurring salt marshes. I'm not entirely sure why that might be, but it might just be something to do with the rotting down of the original vegetation that's now flooded by the tides. You also need to be careful about, this isn't anywhere on the dart by the way, you need to be careful about development, the use of the foreshore, the respect of the foreshore. I mean, this slide at the bottom, a lot of salt marsh here has been lost because people have been dragging their boats over the top of it because it's softer to their boats. But, you know, that's restricted the light getting to the salt marsh, and that salt marsh has been lost. Or somebody's built a bonfire, and the driest place to do it is right on the top of the salt marsh. We need people to understand salt marsh, why it's important, why we need it, why we need to respect it.
You've got 2 minutes, Nigel.
Okay. We might even need to be kind of careful about wildlife and grazing. This, you know, things like Canada geese, they can graze a lot of marsh, and if you walk over the area, it's quite well fertilised by the Canada geese. I'm going to come on to what we're hoping to do from the project, but also with the amount of nutrients that we have in our estuaries, there's a huge amount of growth of seaweed, and sometimes this will smother the salt marsh. One of the things that we need to do as well is to improve water quality, so we get less of this seaweed on the growth. So the Saltmarsh project, initially what we've done is looked at the areas of the Dart using satellite images, identified where we know salt marshes, where it might be, where it might possibly be, and gone back to old maps as well and looked at where we've lost salt marsh. And then just recently we've been ground truthing those areas to see if there is any salt marsh there. So these are tidal pools behind the embankment on the Kingswear side. Actual fact, it looks a bit green, but that's more algae than salt marsh, so not there. And it's probably not worth, you know, the whole problem of getting plants and things there to do anything active there. But other places, you know, we need experts to come along, survey the health of these salt marshes, and then prescribe what conservation management might be suggested to the landowner, because we very, very much need the full cooperation and permission and everything of the landowner to improve these salt marshes, both for biodiversity and their carbon take-up, their blue carbon. So it's traditional to finish on a flowery sunset slide. I'm just unfortunately I don't have one of the darks. So I'll line up the next one.
It's now Sarah. Yes. So while Nigel lines up Sarah's slides, I'm going to introduce Sarah Collins from Plymouth University. Thank you for coming all the way from Plymouth to talk to us. And Sarah is in the School of Biological and Marine Sciences at Plymouth. She's an associate professor in animal behaviour, and her main research area is birds, particularly communication, both visual and vocal, and conservation. And she mainly teaches students in zoology, conservation biology, and animal behaviour and welfare. So, Sarah, over to you.
I shall steal the pointer. I don't have a good track record with these now.
Do you want to make sure it's working first?
Yeah. Oh, yes, it is. So, I've already been introduced, so you know who I am. I just wanted to say that I've loved estuaries ever since my parents moved down here when I was 17, and they moved to West Charlton, which some of you might know, on the Kingsbridge Saltmarsh estuary. And having come from near Birmingham, it was just like, wow, all this wildlife, all these birds, and yeah, I was just sold on estuaries from that point on. I'm going to mainly be talking about bird use of salt marshes and estuaries in general, and obviously Mike's the expert on the birds around here, and we'll be talking in much more detail, I think, about specific species. But I just wanted to say I mainly have worked on communication, as Isabel mentioned, and looked at bird song in particular, but I've always been interested in trying to use behavioural observations to improve conservation. So I've had a lot of students in particular doing projects looking at different aspects of estuary birds. So I'll talk a little bit about some of those projects and the kinds of things they found and why those might be important. So obviously, what do birds do on the salt marsh? Most of us would expect that they would be foraging. The Saltmarsh and the estuary itself are obviously incredibly rich, and as Nigel said, there's a lot of diversity in plant life. There is then the diversity in the invertebrate life, including the insects that are kind of further up on the plants that are sticking out of the sea more often. So they're quite rich in terms of their food for foraging, but birds also use the estuary for roosting and sheltering, particularly the salt marshes, because they're often somewhat protected. And all of these three behaviours you'll see in the birds that are resident on the estuary, that you'll see all year round. Also, those three things will be happening for the birds that are overwintering there, and for the ones that are just on their way through to somewhere else while they're migrating. And that can be really important. This is often a way that they kind of stock up on reserves and are able to then survive to the next year if they're able to do all of these things. And the roosting and the sheltering is actually incredibly important, because that's when they are not having to battle against the elements, not having to fly around and so on. And you've already seen a very similar diagram, but the idea I just wanted to show you here is that the fact that you've got salt marsh next to the estuary gives you all these slightly different substrates with slightly different characteristics, different plants, slightly different invertebrates, different amounts of time that they're free of water. And all of that is really useful if you're a bird, because it gives you lots of options. So it does mean that although the diversity might not be massive, you've got quite a few different species shown by some of the silhouettes here. I'll get onto the actual species in a second, that can use different parts of the habitat, or sometimes move from one part of the habitat to another. So you've got diverse plant life, the structure leading to diverse invertebrate colonies, and then that leads to diverse bird life where there's lots of different things to forage, as well as the structure that provides shelter for them to roost in. So I'm not going to go through all the birds. I think you'll hear more about those later. So it's just going to be, because I can't resist putting lots of pictures of birds in. I have to say, all my students, when they come to do particularly zoology and animal behaviour and welfare, all they want to know about is fluffy things. And I just keep giving them birds. And they do like them by the end of their degree, or else. So you'll see a lot of different waders, and the waders will vary in size and shape. And I know many of you might be expert bird watchers, so you'll know who all these are, what all these are, and you'll know what they do. But the thing to flag up for me is the fact that you've got all these different sizes and shapes of beaks in a bunch of what's kind of pretty similar looking birds. I mean, they're all kind of long-legged, pointy-beaked creatures, and that pointy beak, almost like tweezers, is what is enabling them to forage really successfully on all the invertebrates that are in the mud, so they can poke and kind of pull them out. But those different shapes and sizes, something weird's happened to some of the birds, they've lost their heads there. Believe me, there were heads when I set on today. So you've got these different sizes and shapes of bills, and what you can see is that, you know, in the mud you've got all these invertebrates that are burrowed down into the mud, and different species will be able to reach to different levels. If your beak is stronger, like the oyster catcher, you might be able to take on bigger shellfish. But it means that the invertebrate diversity is essential to the bird diversity, but it's a little bit harder to measure the invert diversity. You have to get out and dig the mud up, and I know Nigel's been doing things like that in the past. But the birds actually, which is why I also like them, they're quite easy to spot, and they can give you a really good indicator of the health of a place, because they kind of show you what's going on underneath. But there are issues. So Nigel already mentioned about the algae. So we know that these algal mats, which some of you will have seen out on the estuaries, sometimes they're much smaller than this obviously, but sometimes they can get quite thick, and they tend to get thicker when there's more pollution and when it's warmer. So, you know, we know that this might get worse with climate change, and I've had a lot of students looking at the foraging success of birds that are foraging where there are these algal mats that are covering some of the substrate. And basically, if there's a little bit of it, it's actually good, because it keeps the mud wet for longer, the invertebrates stay near the top, so they start to burrow down as the mud dries out. But if it's very thick, so if you start to get really thick mats, some of them can't get their beak all the way through to still get into the mud. And also it can get anoxic, so there's no oxygen getting to the mud underneath, and that can have an impact on the invertebrates. And the students were actually able to kind of count the birds kind of walking, the paces, how many times they probed into the mud, and they could even see when they caught prey. And from that you can pick up how successful they are in different areas and get an idea of how suitable the habitat is. So it might be quite labour intensive, but it is a nice way to look at where the habitat is most beneficial for the birds. One of the other things that birds sometimes have problems with is obviously it's us. So the fact that they often want to roost and take shelter. If there are people going around, particularly with dogs off lead, and I have a dog, and yes, sometimes it's off the lead, and it's just one of those things that is going to happen. But it's one of the things that Nigel mentioned, that we need to be respectful of the birds that are in that area and know that if we flush them, they're going to use quite a lot of energy. And the same will be true for people who are out on the water. If the birds at that time when the tide is in are sheltering, there are ways that you can do those leisure activities that cause less disturbance. And in the past I had a PhD student who actually looked at different ways people could use things like canoes in this case and small boats to be less likely to actually flush birds. And a lot of it is about how you approach them, how fast you go, how much noise you make, and so on. So there are all these different feeding gills of birds, all these different feeding types going on, but they are suffering to some extent from some disturbance. Of course, on top of all the waders, well, I've concentrated on those because that's where most of my work has been. You've got a whole bunch of the fish-eating birds here, the cormorants, kingfishers, little egrets, grey herons. Interestingly, most of these are on the green list in the UK of least conservation concern. On the other slide, most of the waders are on either amber or red. So clearly something's not so bad, or apparently not so bad in terms of fish eaters. And you've also, what I think of as the kind of dabblers, you've got shelduck, and I know I looked at the stats and there was only ever one widgeon on the Dart, but there are lots of them on the Kingsbridge and Saltmarsh estuary that have spent more time, and they ought to be on the Dart. So. But these are obviously eating things like the seagrass vegetation and often the water snails. But then you've got the invasive species as well, the Canada goose, that is taking up space, taking up nutrients that might be available to other individuals and fertilising the area quite a lot, which can lead to changes in the water quality. And there aren't just those, there are also obviously birds using the estuary, but also the Saltmarsh specifically, birds of prey. So you have ospreys, but also maybe marsh harriers and some other species that will sometimes be hunting the waders, but it's clearly still important that they use that habitat. Lots of small birds, I've just put them under small birds, like sedge warblers and reed buntings, particularly if there are reed beds, but even when there aren't reed beds where they could potentially nest, you get birds coming down to eat the seeds on some of that grass and the plants that are growing. And you obviously get lots of gulls, and some of those are actually on the red list, some species are on the red list, so they are endangered, and the corvids, mainly the carrion crows, stalking around. So you've got all these different types of birds on the estuary, all using it and using the Saltmarsh, because if they're using the estuary, they're probably going to be using the Saltmarsh as well. And just to give you an idea, this is the latest red list. You don't have to read every single one, but I've highlighted the birds on the red list that are typical that will use estuaries, and you can see it's quite a big proportion of the birds that are on the red list. And this is the most species that have ever been on the red list. So things definitely we need to be monitoring this and hopefully doing something. It was nice to see that Nigel's got lots of ideas about how things can be improved. And as we can see, it's not getting better. These are the number of species and the different categories. So red list basically means numbers are really decreasing substantially, and often that there's not a large population elsewhere in the world. Amber, it's kind of keep your eye on it, and green, not doing too badly. But the green is getting smaller, the red is getting bigger, and the former breeder, meaning they're not breeding anymore in the UK, it's also increasing. So we do really need to keep our eye on these birds. And we've already talked about, or Nigel's already talked about the things that are problems for particularly estuary birds, saltmarsh birds, climate change, the increase in temperature affects those algal mats. If they get thicker and bigger, that causes potentially more problems. We need to keep our eye on it. Sea level rise, and as Nigel pointed out, the salt marshes in the South Hants in particular can't kind of creep up the same way that Saltmarshes and other areas do, because there's often either barriers, small cliffs or agricultural land right behind them, so they can't just kind of shift as the sea level rises. And disturbance, we need to keep our eye on that. There can be more types of disturbance as more and more people are starting to use estuaries for leisure. Pollution, one of the things that people have recently become very interested in, of course, is microplastics, and that hasn't always been thought about. We often think about the nitrates and potentially things from boats, but pollution that is microplastics could have an impact on the birds, because they're eating the inverts, which are filter feeders, and they're going to be picking up all the microplastics. And any kind of development or use of the habitat by us might mean the birds can't use it. So these are all things that we have to consider, things that we need to keep our eye on, things that hopefully you guys will be inspired to do something about. And one of the first things to do, I think, is just keeping our eye on what is happening out there, what species are there, how many of them, what kind of activities are they doing. And thank you for listening, obviously. But I'd also like to thank the project students, because they've been brilliant and stood out on estuaries for hours. Not, unfortunately, the Dart, although and now I feel more inspired to send them here as well. They've mostly been Kingsbridge, Salcombe, around Plymouth, the Ex. Mick Hanley, I picked his brains about some Saltmarsh stuff. I know Nigel works with him sometimes. And Nigel at the Bioregional Learning Centre for inviting me along tonight. So thank you very much. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So now I'm going to hand over to Mike Langman. So Mike is a Devon birder since the age of 10. He worked for the RSPB at its headquarters in Sandy, Bedfordshire for 9 years before returning to Devon in 1992 as a freelance bird illustrator and bird wildlife guide. He served voluntarily as Devon bird recorder for 10 years. And he regularly runs guided wildlife cruises on the Dart and leads walks for Sharpen Trust, which is where I met Mike a few years back.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike.
Okay, Nigel, that's ready to go. Thank you very much. Yeah, my interest in the Darts began while I was a YOC member. Some of you might have been YOC members, a Young Ornithologist Club. It was a junior section of the RSPB at the time. And I went on a cruise with a chap called Tony Soper, a Southampton resident, and he used to run boat trips up and down the Darts from Dartmouth on a boat called the Scomber. He ran those for a few years, and I became fascinated with the wildlife we've seen. In fact, in about 3 years, I did about 5 or 6 trips with Tony. And it was just fantastic to go up and down the river and seeing some of the different species of birds you could find at that time. That would be back in the mid-70s. Sadly, as far as bird population goes, most of those birds on the Darts have either gone or decreased in numbers dramatically. There were nowhere near as many birds as there were in those days. But the good thing is, with this project carrying on, the work we can do to hopefully improve the habitats, we can help some of those birds to either hold themselves where they are in populations or perhaps even increase. I'm going to take you through a few of the birds you'd like to see on the estuary. I was going to tell you a lot more, but it's all been said, so I can just show you some pretty pictures of birds now, I think, and tell you a little bit about each of the species as we go through it, so I won't keep you very long. So looking at the habitats here, this is typical of the River Dart. As Nigel said right at the very beginning, you've got the steep-sided Ria, an inundated river, which unfortunately means it's not that brilliant for wildfowl, wading birds and wildfowl itself. And the reason for that is there's a long, narrow, meandering river with shallow sides and not very much mud. If you go to the Ex estuary, even the Tean estuary, the Salcombe estuary, the Salcombe estuary in Kingsbridge, even the River Plym, a very short estuary, you find far more species of birds on those estuaries than you ever do on the Dart. And the reason for that is they're much more open. You've got vast expanses of mud, big areas of mud, unlike the Dart. Though there's a lot of mud on the Dart, you think about the Dart, it's one of the longest estuaries in South Devon, nearly 10 miles long from sea up to the top to the weir at Totnes. But it's very narrow, which means it's prone to disturbance, and there's not as much mud expanding over a very shallow area, which makes it difficult for the birds to find the food. On the high tides, They do come and roost on these salt marshes. In fact, you can see in this picture here, probably Canada geese mixed in there with the Canada geese. There'll be some wading birds, maybe a few curlew, maybe some redshank, common sandpiper probably in there, and a few smaller birds which come down to the edge of the estuary to feed. So you might find linnets and goldfinches coming down and feeding on the seed heads of some of the plants which grow in the salt marsh itself. In the little creeks, as the tide rises, you'll find that the herons and the egrets will go and feed. While the river is so high, they can't feed on the main estuary, but they will go into these creeks and find fish and crabs and small mollusks they can feed on in those areas. The area at the back here is Sharpen Marsh, and in fact, there was a nice slide from Sarah just earlier on which showed you the extent of Fleet Mill Pond opposite Sharpen. There's another nice area of reed bed in there as well. These reed beds are quite different from most of the estuaries you find in the southwest, South Hants. So you've got lots of common reed growing here which will attract the birds, as Sarah pointed out, like reed bunting. We also get breeding reed warblers in there. There are Chetty's warblers, a fairly recent addition to Totnes. They turned up in the 1970s and have spread rapidly, but they require these habitats of reed beds like this in a fairly mild conditions. Anywhere else in Europe and further north, they're only insectivorous. They feed on insects, nothing else. If they can't find insects during the winter time, they will die. So being able to survive here in the mild climate and mild winters, they can survive the winter in these reed beds. Are very important. It'd be interesting in discussion later on with Sarah and with Nigel. Since the sea wall got breached at the top there at Sharpen Marsh, there is more saline water coming through into the marsh itself. How that's affecting the reed bed, I'd be interested to discuss that later on. And the same goes with Fleet Mill Pond. The sea wall is breached, so there's more salt water going into that area, so it's not so fresh water as before. So some of the birds you likely find on the estuary then, which Sarah mentioned a few of them, I'll just mention a couple more. On the lower stretches of the Dart, you're likely to find oyster catchers. Sarah pointed them out. These are feeding primarily on bivalves, so they will take worms, they will take ragworm and lugworm as well, but they're primarily looking for bivalves. So mussels, cockles are looking for as well. The lower edge of the Darts, you've got more sandy conditions rather than muddy conditions, you'll find more oyster catchers down there, less oyster catchers at the top end of the Dart itself. And I don't know if you know, but oyster catchers, they actually have different shaped bills. So you have some which are chiselers, a bit like this one, which will chisel in and force a shell open. There are others called hammerers, which have a heavier bill. So the end of the bill is much more bulky, and they will hammer the shell and break a hole into it. So you have hammerers and chiselers. And within a population, you can have both hammerers and chiselers surviving together and feeding in different ways. This is an oyster catcher in winter plumage. So if you see them on the estuary at the moment, they're just beginning to change. In wintertime, they have the vicar's collar, the little white collar at the front of the neck there. During the summer, that's lost completely, and they're much brighter birds. The bills are much more orange, and the legs are much more pink. So this is a winter plumage bird. On the estuary, the Dart is actually quite an important estuary for curlew, although the numbers have declined dramatically. I'm going to show you some figures in a little while over the years. But our biggest wading birds, long bill, unfortunately in population declining rapidly through the whole of the UK, not just as a wintering species, but also as a breeding species as well. Curlews used to breed on Dartmoor. We're down to just 1 or 2 pairs. And in fact, if there wasn't work going on at the moment, we would probably have lost curlew as a breeding species in Devon completely. So really, it's just a wintering species you find on places like the River Dart. That long bill, perfect for probing deep into the mud to take especially lugworm and ragworm that they can find. If you're lucky, during the spring and during the autumn, we get a very close relative turning up, and that is the whimbrel. It looks very similar, doesn't it? And the whimbrel is slightly smaller. It has this dark band on top of the head. The bill's not quite so long, and it's less curved down throughout the whole length. It's more curved towards the end of the bill. They have a fantastic name. When you see it migrating, they call this 7-point whistler, and that's because they call it a 7-point whistler. The curlew, I'm sure you all know what I call it, so it's meant to be saying curlew all the time. But the whimbrel on migration, when they turn up usually in April and early May, they're on migration through to Scandinavia or as far as Greenland. They migrate through Britain, often in good numbers as well. So when you see them, they're often in flocks of 10, 15, maybe 30 or 40. The curlews you only see in flocks during the high tide periods when they're roosting on the salt marshes themselves. Another bird which is relatively common on the estuary is the redshank. So small wading birds with a straight bill, straight bill and those bright red legs. And we have another bird occasionally turning up on darts called the greenshank, very like the redshank but paler, with a longer bill which is slightly upturned, but importantly it has bluish greenish legs. So that's the other species you find on the dart, but redshank is much more common. But again, unfortunately, has declined over the years, although some figures I'm going to show you in a minute looks like it's increasing. And a small wading bird, this is a common sandpiper. This is really a summer visitor. They do breed in Devon, they breed on Dartmoor and some fast-flowing rivers, but much more common on our estuaries during the winter time when they move down to survive on our estuaries to feed. Small wading birds, and the salt marshes are very important for these birds because not only do they roost on the salt marshes, but they will also feed. So the curlews and the redshanks will generally just go to a salt marsh to roost. The common sandpiper will go there to roost and to feed at the same time. If ever you see one walking around, although they might look like many other wading birds, the important thing when they're walking around, this tail, you can see it's slightly blurred there, is always bobbing up and down. So the tail is always bobbing up and down, very white underneath. So common sandpiper. And Sharper Marshes and Fleet Mill Pond and the top end of the Dart are very good places to view these. Now, when Tony Soper used to run the cruises on the Darts, we still in those days had good numbers of lapwing, black and white ones here, and also a few golden plover mixed in with them as well. And they would come in to roost sometimes in numbers on the big open mud flats opposite Stoke Gabriel. So if you know Stoke Gabriel, looking across the Yuck Plug, there's a big area of expansive mud down there. They would roost over there, sometimes in flocks of 40, 50, even 100 plus. Sadly, they've all gone. You still find them elsewhere in Devon. So if you go to River Exe, if ever you've been on one of the cruises up the Exe, you'll find good numbers of golden plover up there towards Exminster Marshes and sometimes on the estuary itself. But sadly, the Dart, we lost those. And in fact, we pretty much lost lapwing, unless you get a really cold period during the winter time when the birds are forced from further north. You won't find lapwing on the Dart anymore at all. Just some figures here from Webb's counts. This is waterfowl counts from the Dart over the years. I just thought I'd show you a few figures there. So curlew numbers, you can see from 2000, we were on 140 birds on Webb's count. So this is people, volunteers, going out and counting at various points up and down the Dart on a particular day during the month. So each month. And these are the maximum figures for the year for the River Dart. So the maximum figure in 2000 was 140 curlew. Look what we're down to now. This was 2 years ago. And I suspect last year it was even worse again. Very, very sad to see the numbers declining. Now, I find this surprising. The redshank numbers appear to be increasing. Now, from my own experience, going up and down on the Dart on cruises, redshank numbers have declined. So why this appears to be picking up, I really, really don't know. Whether it's better coverage by the surveyors and different methodology, I don't know, but it appears to be increasing. I would say they're definitely decreasing. Oyster catcher numbers, they've declined a bit, but they're sort of holding their own. They're doing pretty well. They're not disturbed so easily. The top two species there, unfortunately, during the high tides, they do get disturbed very easily. And the narrow river of the Dart means that any traffic going up and down, paddle boarders, canoeists, anybody up the Dart will flush those birds away from the salt marshes. Other interesting species, common sandpiper, you can see there, that's probably just the people recording the area. The numbers seem to be picking up. I don't think that really is the case. Shellbut numbers have declined a little bit, but not very much. And again, it's variable depending on the end, depending where the people are watching and when they're watching. Canada geese. Now you can see the numbers increasing. Now last year I counted a flock of 400 plus flying down the river, and I counted the flocks and I took pictures of them, so I knew there were 400 plus birds moving down the river. So that was last year. So we've gone from 340 in 2020 to over 400 birds. So they're increasing dramatically. Grey herons, they're sort of almost holding their own, not doing too bad, a slight decrease there, but look at this, little egrets. Fantastic little bird. When I started bird watching in the 80s, a very rare bird. In fact, I remember jumping in my car, well, jumping in a friend's car, so I couldn't drive in those days, and driving down to Kingsbridge Estuary to see my very first little egrets. Now they're more common on the River Dart, then in grey heron. And they're breeding around Sharpen and a couple of the heronries further downriver. Another couple of species there, really hardly anything at all. Dunlin, although they do occur on the Dart, are incredibly rare, so the Webb's counts didn't record any at all in any of those years. And greenshank, again, likewise, quite a rare bird. So herons, they feed around the estuary on the high tide. They're a stealth hunter, so they will stand there and wait for the prey to come to them. If you ever see them, they're standing very quiet on the edge of the estuary and wait for the prey to come to them, unlike the little egrets, which is a hunter. And if you've ever seen them walking around, have you seen their bright yellow feet? But those bright yellow feet are used for scaring prey as they move through the water. So they go through water and they often shake their bright yellow feet to frighten shrimps and prawns and fish away in front of them, and then the little egret will start chasing. It will run around the edge of the estuary chasing the prey. And again, it will do that on the salt marshes in little pools which are left as a tide comes in and goes out. Shelduck, numbers are sort of holding there, are not doing too badly. This time of year you start seeing them in pairs. They're paired up already, and the males have the lumpy top to the bill, the females lack the lumpy top and also got a bit of white feathering at the top of the bill there. Unlike most ducks, both males and females are very similar in plumage. Most ducks you find the females are very drab and dull because they're nesting in open areas. A shelduck nests underground and will often nest in rabbit burrows, going underneath the ground to nest in those burrows. So the female doesn't need to camouflage plumage like other ducks. They're feeding mostly on hydrobia. Hydrobia are tiny little shells which you find in the mud itself. And the shelduck will sweep its bill through the mud to pick up these hydrobia. It will then close its bill, and it has what we call lamellae down the side of the bill, and little almost like teeth-like structures. And as it closes its bill, the mud squirts out, and the little shells are held inside. They then swallow the shells whole, and they can digest the inside of the shells within their stomach.
You've got 2 minutes, Mike.
Yep, okay, need finish. Very pretty, I know, and they look stunning, but I really don't like Canada geese. They were introduced into Britain probably just before Victorian times, and they've increased dramatically, so from relatively few birds. And unfortunately, unlike other geese, which you really don't find on the River Dart very much, they don't migrate. So they're here all the time. The birds you see here during the winter time are the same ones you're going to see there in the summertime. And they're increasing dramatically. They're aggressive, they chase away other birds from breeding areas. All in all, they might be pretty, but they're not a very nice bird, in my opinion. You can see here there's a flock of them taking off the water there, but more and more of them every single year. You travel up and down the Dart, you see more and more of them. What we need are predators, and unfortunately there's not much which will take a Canada goose. A fox had given half a chance, perhaps an otter given half a chance, but they're unlikely to take very many. We really need some big predators, don't we? There we go, how about one of those? Well, last year, one of these spent 10 days on the River Dart. It's a white-tailed eagle. It was one of the introduced birds from the Isle of Wight, and it's radio tagged, so we know it's there. The news wasn't released until after the bird had gone to make sure people weren't travelling down and frightening the thing off. But it spent 10 days in Julian, Greatwood is it called? Yeah. In Greatwood, just south of Saltmarsh. And it spent 10 days there feeding, hopefully, on Canada geese. Certainly wasn't taking any big dogs away at the moment anyway. But if you've ever seen one, you'll know about it. People say they think they've seen an eagle, and it's usually a buzzard.
How big?
And the wingspan, they call this the flying barn doors, because the wingspan is over 8 foot. So yeah. And on that point, rather than the sunrise or sunset, I'd like to finish. So thank you very much.
We saw white-tailed eagles in Mull. We got quite close to them in kayaks. And there was a whole boat of birders who were furious that we hadn't realised that the eagles were there, and we kind of crept up on them, not meaning to, but we got way closer than the birders ever did, and they were yelling at us and telling us to go away. So what we're going to do now is have a very quick discussion. Time's moving on. I want to open up the floor to all of you for your questions. So what we thought we'd do is kind of close down the projector and maybe move our chairs a little bit closer to the audience.
forward a little bit.
So I've got a question to start this conversation off between the three of you, which is that people's concern and passion for rivers is growing all the time. I mean, many of you in the audience, I'm sure, have come because you care very deeply about the Dart and you want to be able to do something about it. And certainly at the Bioregional Learning Centre, we're always looking for ways in which we can invite people in the local community into projects to find a role and to be able to contribute to the health and well-being of water. So I wonder if one by one you could give us some ideas about how, with the Saltmarsh project, we've got this interesting conundrum in a way. Salt marshes perhaps don't want to be interfered with, and certainly the birds don't really want to be disturbed. What could people in this room do to notice whether a salt marsh is in good condition and be able to report back, or go and look at one in a way that doesn't disturb it? We'd like to, maybe Nigel goes first on that one. You've been thinking a lot about that.
Yeah, well, to be honest, I'm not sure. Might sound strange, but no, I'm not sure. We do need some expertise on salt marshes, you know, just because they look healthy. I think what we ideally want is some real salt marsh experts that can give us an idea what the condition is, and can it, and can it actually be enhanced? But there will be situations too where actually they're just best left. So, in all honesty, no, I don't know.
Okay, we're thinking about that. This is only month 3 of the research and development project, so these are the questions we're pondering. Yes, Mike?
Yeah. The salt marshes themselves, I mean, they're used primarily by the particularly bird life for roosting and resting areas. And so, as I point out, some of them do feed there. But there's a fantastic example of a salt marsh on the Plym estuary. Some of you might know Blackstone Meadow near Saltmarsh Marsh, Saltmarsh House. Now that's, again, a breached wall area, seawall. The water comes and goes from there, but only on really highest tides. They've created a nature reserve there, so people are not meant to access the area on the high tide. There's a hide built, so people can go in without disturbing the birds and watch the salt marsh area. And there's lots of good data coming back from Webb's Council and from other people observing the area, just to let people know what's going on and what birds are being seen there. So it can be protected, that's great, and if you can restrict people, particularly, you mentioned dogs before, people with dogs going into these areas, that's also important. The good thing about the Dart is nearly all of it's privately owned. It's very difficult to get access to some of these little salt marshes you've got alongside the Dart, so they have their own protection, which is good. I wouldn't like to see too much more in the way of public access to those areas increasing, which is a possibility in the future. That would be my concern.
So I think, for me, it's, in the end, you can only really make the changes for things like reducing disturbance by working together with the people who are using it, and that's not my expertise. I'm the sort of biologist who goes out and looks at what the birds are doing, but I think finding ways to convince people to not do the activities that are more likely to disturb the birds. Can you work with the people who rent out canoes or rent out paddle boards, so that they can at least give some brief handy hints of how not to disturb birds or where not to go. But I think it's possible that's where you guys can help more, thinking about what we might do to change. Well, I mean, it's pleasure for, as you said, it's the estuary is a resource for making people feel better, but you don't want that to have a negative impact. But so you have to kind of, I think, just work together really, which is why these kind of projects are really useful, because you can't do it just from the animal side, I suppose.
Yeah, thank you. We'd love to hear from you now, what your ideas are, your questions are, things you'd like to know. Yes.
Yeah, I've got a question about the responsibility of, say, for example, water companies or private landowners around, say, nitrate pollution. And I wonder how that balances out with individual responsibility of people in this room to, canoe in the Dart, or like what in terms of like impact on bird populations and the health of these salt marshes. Excuse me. What's the balance of responsibility here?
Well, if we're talking about nitrates, Obviously, Southwest Water will treat the wastewater, but actually they're only treating what we put in it in the first place. So for us, I would always encourage people, we all need to go to the toilet, but we don't need to put the remnants of the Sunday lunch down the sink in waste disposal units, because it just gets, the water treatment works actually break that down into a fertiliser that is then super available to the plants, and probably the wrong plants to grow. But of course, it's not just households, but also what we use in our gardens, what the farmers use. So in that instance, it's probably least about the water company. That's much more of an issue when we come to swimming in the dark.
Does that have presumably an effect on the algae?
Yes, there's been a lot of research done up in Scotland, particularly on the Eithne estuary, and nitrates are implicated in that growth of green algae over the mudflats. I don't know if it's such a problem in the dark, but it's certainly a big problem at Kingsbridge.
Yes.
Yeah, hi.
Oh.
Okay, my name's Hal. I've got too many questions really, so I'll just start with an offer. So I'm a commercial operator on the Dart. Canoe Adventures, the big canoes, and Totnes kayaks do the rentals out. And I'm a member of the Dart Harbour Commercial Users Group and the Stoke Gable Boating Association. So if it's about understanding better how river users cause disturbance and educating and raising awareness and doing that, then that's an offer. I'm happy to be part of the project and to learn from what you know and spread that around basically. So that's my offer, and also about monitoring it as well. So we'd love to help what we can in an amateur way monitoring it. There may be a little exchange then. If you help us train us up to be better at wildlife spotting, and then we can do our best to record. It's no requirement of our staff to be wildlife experts, that's really important, but we want to be better at what we do and know. So
I had a PhD student a while ago, and their role, it was quite a long time ago actually, but anyway, their role was to work with businesses and the people kind of monitoring the area, and the idea is that you provide something really simple, because obviously you've got a business to run and you're busy. You want something really simple where you can just say, do these few things, don't do these few things, and it's something that you don't have to spend lots of time worrying about. So in her case, she was finding out that, for example, if you approach head on, it's worse than approaching kind of obliquely. If you're very quiet and then suddenly make a lot of noise, it's a problem. And sometimes canoes, weirdly, although they're very quiet, they can be worse because they almost surprise them when they get very close, whereas a louder boat partly stays further away and they can hear it coming and kind of keep an eye on it. But there's things, so what she ended up developing was literally a waterproof laminated sheet that literally stuck on the front of the canoe with some things with ticks and some things with crosses next to, and that worked quite well. She was actually doing it with sea otters, but it's the same principle, that you can work together, and it's much better to do that and actually, like I said, provide a little bit of information for your people to tell somebody going out on a canoe, this is what you can do. So it'd be really good to do that, because you have to work with people who are doing what you're doing as well.
Can I just ask, do you use stand-up paddleboards as well, or not?
Yeah, we have to,
From my point of view, watching stand-up paddleboards being used on estuaries, they cause one of the biggest problems. It's such an obvious person stood up high on the board rather than the canoe. The canoes tend to be a bit lower down, but the stand-up paddleboard is obviously a person coming towards them. And that does frighten the birds. I think it's important, and the other thing with stand-up paddleboards is they can get into much shallower water, which means they're approaching some of those salt marshes and roosting areas much closer than other canoes and boats can actually get to them. So that's something they should be just wary of. I know it's spectacular when a big flock of bird goes up in front of you. It looks fantastic, it's wonderful, but it's disturbance. And the birds don't need that, particularly during the winter time. Or any
if you
time.
put it in the paddles, you put in the canoes, the geese will fly, whereas you go past on a motorboat and they stay put. It's quite interesting.
It's movement which we want, but as I say, stand-up paddleboards, from my point of view, cause the most disturbance more than anything else. But Sarah said, if you put something in the saying, if you see a flock of birds, please keep away from them. That's probably the best thing you can do.
There's also a cumulative impact to the physical disturbance from paddlecraft as well. Just from, you'll be launching from sort of pucker places, but individual paddle boards need to be carried down onto the water rather than dragged. And also when you're really in the shallows, just trying not to punt off the bottom. Probably more of an issue for seagrasses that you can be floating over more than salt marshes. And yes, individually it's a tiny little bit of damage, but with a growing number of people involved, the cumulative impact may be something that we need to be concerned about.
Julian.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Julian from Sharpham, which is featured a bit. We're very keen to be involved. We've got a whole rewilding project going on at Sharpham, which links in very well. If people are interested, there's an open day on I think it's the 10th of June. I might have got that wrong, but I think it is.
It is, yeah.
Because we're controlling access, we're trying to. But that's on the 10th of June. It's a public open day where we'll be running stuff about this kind of thing. There are particular points we're trying to create where people can access, so that we're controlling it a bit more. There's one off the cycle path into the reed bed, for example, so that people going to that point, but they're not just kind of fanning out everywhere all the time. And we've got a project where we're creating a 20-acre hay meadow in front of the main house, where probably some of you remember the vineyard used to be, and in front of that is Saltmarsh, which is an interesting area. I think having been involved at Sharpham for about 15 years, I am worried that the Saltmarsh has deteriorated generally, and I wonder about a couple of things. One is I think the average, the levels of the river, because of silting up, is increasing gradually, and then the wash from the boats has more impact, and the habitat can't respond quick enough to that change. And then also the walling, we've got hundreds and hundreds of metres of stone wall around the marsh, and then all the way along really, and around the Saltmarsh, which is deteriorated. And I think that probably needs to be maintained to reduce degradation of the Saltmarsh, because I know it's deteriorating, it's washing away, or it's fragmenting. That photo of the patch opposite, sort of opposite the main reed beds that I think Mike showed, that's deteriorated, I think, in the last decade compared to what it was. And I think it's this combination of the silting up of the river and the wash from particularly the ferries. Over time it's wearing away, and then there's the geese problem as well. I'm not sure, it'd be nice to, lovely as they are, maybe we could, maybe that's an area where we should encourage dogs. I don't know.
Should put one menu.
There is an area up there that if you look at really old maps, there used to be salt marsh. I don't know the names of the particular bits of shore, but there is a bit that we've been up in one of the harbour boats where it would be lovely to be able to reinstate the old edge of the salt marsh and then do something to bring the level of the mudflat up so that it only gets flooded occasionally by the tides and encourage salt marsh to grow.
Well, it's interesting. So we've repaired some bits of. If you think of the bit in front of the house, that on the promontory, if you like, and I've repaired some bits of gaps of like 10, 20 metres of stone face bank, really, stone wall, and I've seen that the mud collects. You would make it quite quickly in a couple of years. So it washes away, and then the mud washes away. If you reinstate the wall, even if it's like a foot or 2 foot, the mud recollects quite quickly and starts to recreate the salt marsh.
So you don't need to import extra sediment at all.
No.
And that's how the carbon builds up, because there'll be a lot of organic material in that as well. And if it builds up, it becomes anoxic, which I know isn't good for the invertebrates, but when it's anoxic, it actually traps more of the carbon in there.
Julian, thank you. We really want to come and talk to you. We will do that. Thank you. A question over here, the lady.
No, I was just going to say, on the first time I ever did one of the cruises down on the commentary, they said it's quite interesting that Prince Charles many years ago had come down to have a look at the walls because apparently he owns some of it, and his comment was that he would repair it when he was king. Which I don't know whether that's still true, because the second time we did it, they didn't mention it. I don't know. If he owns it, then why not? Let's ask him.
Well, the title, the Duchy of Cornwall, owns the bed of many of our local estuaries. Maybe that was the connection.
Yeah. But they commented on it they made quite a big point about it. Maybe he's forgotten and he just needs reminding.
So if anybody has a chat with him, you might
You've got a question.
I think the numbers of Canada geese are hugely concerning. I mean, they're obviously on an exponential growth curve. In 3 years' data, it's really a problem. I just wondered, Sarah, whether there's any specific evidence of Canada geese displacing some of the other species, like curlew, for example, and whether anybody is actually working on that, because it should be quite a straightforward study.
Well, I mean, it's brilliant. It's a great idea. I've got some project students looking for ideas at the moment, but it'd be a wonderful thing, because it's the kind of thing that you just need somebody to be there over a number of days and just looking at what happens in terms of movements and what triggers that movement. So
it'd be a great way to engage some of the, the ornithologists working in the area and get them just to specifically look at that.
I don't know. I mean, Mike might know better, but I think the Canada geese, are they using slightly different areas to the...
They will use those salt marshes during the high tide periods where they still graze, but they will also move in the fields. Unfortunately, the curlews on a very high tide will move into fields as well. So
that's what I'm thinking.
the Canada geese are aggressive and they will chase other things off. So if a curlew gets nearby, they'll see them off.
And I suppose the second question is there a precedent for actually controlling a nuisance species like that, where the other species which are, red list, are absolutely at risk because of a specific
I don't know, with Canada geese particularly, I don't know.
No, I mean, it usually opens a giant can of worms.
I'm sure it does,
because
but we've got to actually intervene, surely.
I think it's one of the things we have to discuss in, the ethical aspects of conservation. To what extent do you worry about individual welfare versus a species welfare, and what kind of methods would you use? How would people feel about it? Who does it? If they do it, what kind of pushback are they going to get? Because obviously killing a whole bunch of birds is going to have some bad publicity. There's possibly other methods. I mean, people obviously with gulls trying to get them to move places. They are protected because they're not invasive and they're actually endangered. But it's quite difficult to find methods that continue to work. Most of the birds just get used to whatever it is, unless somebody mentioned let the dogs out. But I think even that you would get in trouble.
There was a much smaller population, but we had ruddy ducks breeding in Britain a few years ago, and their numbers increased dramatically, and then we're starting to interfere with the Eurasian white-headed duck, and we're interbreeding, so they were basically endangering a full species. So the ruddy ducks were eliminated. We're trying to eliminate, but there was a lot of they were shot, but there was a lot of backlash on that. I mean, the ruddy duck was brought in from North America, brought in and then spread. But they were shot, but there was a huge backlash, and I think a lot of recent reports of ruddy duck, people keep it quiet because rather than finishing the population off, they'd rather keep it quiet, which will mean that population will start growing again.
But you don't have to use such dramatic methods, you can just collect the eggs, for example.
That's not easy to do with something like a ruddy duck. You have to.
Well, I was thinking of the Canada geese.
With Canada geese, you could, it could be done.
Because they issue licenses, don't they, even to farmers, for instance, when they had kind of birds that were accessing grains. So I can't even remember what was on the list, but I was pretty shocked that some of those were species that you would imagine would be on the red list.
In Scotland, they're still able to shoot pink-footed goose.
So if they could do that for farming, surely they could do that for...
Well, Well, I grew up hearing how much grass the Canada geese actually eat, so I'm from a big farm around the area.
Yeah, I'm a vegan as well.
But it's interesting to hear that, because I've often wanted to since becoming a ecologist rather than a farmer, and I'm wondering if they've done that to the grass, what are they doing to the saltmarsh and everything? So it's interesting to hear that tonight. But yeah, grass is a crop around here like rain is there, so yeah. So let the farms do it.
We can take a couple more questions, then we want to bring this to a close. Anybody on this side of the room? Robin?
Yeah, there's not a question. I'd just like to throw a non-technical thing in, something from the literary arts. Okay. Right. This is from Hal Borland in his book, This Hill, This Valley. And he says, any river is the summation of the whole valley. To think of it as nothing but water is to ignore the greater part. The greater part is us and what we do, really. So I just thought there was something non-technical in and a bit hearty.
Yeah. Thank you. Very impressive.
Talk about.
Yes, two more questions.
It was just how can we stay plugged in and get involved and participate?
Great. Well, there are two events coming up. There's one at Kingsbridge on Saturday, which is the South Hams Rivers Assembly, and the Leven Saltmarsh project will be there, along with lots of other different projects as well. And then Bi-Regional Learning Centre and the team who are working on the salt marshes are also holding a Zoom conversation this coming Wednesday at lunchtime, ready to continue this conversation and go much deeper into how local people can become involved and all the different actions that could be taken to help save the salt marsh.
And the poll?
And the poll! Yes, we're going to do a poll in 1 minute's time. We're going to do a poll and ask you all for your opinions and ideas. Yeah.
Can I just say, being involved, science is nothing without data, and conservation is nothing without data as well. So everybody being involved in providing data of anything they see around the estuary, whether it's birds or whatever, if that's provided. And there are lots of ways of doing that through BTO, the British Terrestrial Ornithology, Bird Track. They take records of dragonflies, butterflies, birds, mammals, everything. It's easy to do, and everybody can do that. That data is so important. So as county bird recorder for 20 years, I always try to push people to provide their sightings and their data.
Is that the river you're talking about on that, or the catchment, i.e. all the tributaries that create the dart?
When you provide the data, you're providing for a specific area. So you would say it was Sharper Marsh, you would say it was Totnes, Langmarsh, or wherever. So you provide the data for that specific area. So anywhere, I mean, any data at all. It doesn't have to be just for the river. Any data at all is useful.
Okay.
In the past, a friend, she was working on gulls, in fact, but she developed an app where you could literally log and it would take your GPS position as to what you've seen and what something was doing, and that was quite a useful way of keeping track. And that was to set out. I think it's up and running now as a citizen science project. So the idea is that you get lots and lots of data, and then that provides really good a foundation for thinking about what's going on, because obviously there's a lot of other places where the data is, but it isn't always concentrated by the particular location. I guess I was thinking, so you can get things off eBird, you can get things off iNaturalist, you can get things from the web's counts, but to have something that's local, sometimes that can be a really powerful tool.
That's a very good idea. Muriel, you've got a question.
I have a question. I'm not sure whether it's for the salt marshes or for the River Trust. How do we manage to get a bit less boats or a bit slower boats going up and down the darts? Because I see them going out much faster than
Well, we need the Harbour Authority here to give us advice on that, but
and less boats is difficult because you know, we want people to experience these places so that they have an empathy and build respect. So it's a difficult balance, isn't it?
At least slower.
Yeah.
The Dart Market did discuss that in their meeting the other night. They were saying that in Salcombe, the harbour master there, if he catches you speeding, he'll impound your boat for a week. There's lots of people there contacting fair fine. And they're saying they think that could happen. some cameras maybe, and they can tell how fast the boats are going by the weight they produce,
Yeah.
and then they can identify it and find
Yeah,
them.
because I've really seen some boat really disturbing.
Yeah, because they only caught 16 people speeding in the last year. Because people always slow down when they see them.
Perversely with
absolutely the last question, but
perversely with salt marshes, there's also a speed where you create most wake, and that needs to be avoided as well. And that might be actually slower than the speed limit.
Investigate that. Yes, the last question.
I was just wondering if you were talking about the walls earlier, and I also noticed in one of the slides there were the wooden pegs in the marshes. And I wondered if there was anything that, I haven't kayaked up the river myself yet, but would like to at some point. But I had wondered, if the tide's up, you could obviously go into those marshes, and maybe we should be staying out of them. And what could be if they, like on the narrow rivers because we don't have enough beaver, so they will sort of rewild the edges of the rivers with twigs and sort of build them up with vegetation. If there was anything you could do to sort of expand the marsh or sort of, wooden pegs like you have at the seaside even to prevent the beach from washing away, that would then maybe keep people from, going into those areas and protect them a little bit more,
Yes, certainly where we want to expand.
You wouldn't want to disturb the river bed, but...
Yeah, well, again, it's that balance, and what we mustn't do is create salt marsh where it would erode some of the mud flats as well. I mean, mud flats are even less sexy to look at, but actually they're incredible places in themselves. So it's that balance. What we wouldn't want to do is encourage salt marsh where it would affect navigation, but where it's already shallow, where people don't go, if it can be expanded and it's heading in that direction anyway, let's just kind of give it a little bit of an oomph.
Thank you very much.